Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back to another exciting episode of Canada Today on Muslim Network TV. And I'm your host, Taha Ghayur, back again with some interesting conversations with some amazing people today. Well, today we're going to be talking about a topic that is often considered boring, but we want to bring some excitement to that topic and hear from our guests why they love talking about it and why we should learn more about it. Today we're going to be talking about Islamic History Month, which is a month that is celebrated across Canada in the month of October every year. And it is a month where we celebrate Muslim art, culture, faith, people, cuisine, and anything else that comes with heritage and history. This month is a month where we also reflect on incredible contributions of Islam, Muslims, Canadian Muslims, and anybody else who claims to be part of this community. Today we are joined by two wonderful guests who are going to be talking about why Islamic History Month and why Islamic history in general. So I'd like to first introduce our audience, our first guest, who is no stranger. She has been on our show just a couple weeks back, and I'm so excited to have her back. Dr. Mona Rahman. She is a senior level researcher with over 13 years experience in higher education at Queen's University. Mona is also an Islamic studies educator and education coordinator for the Islamic Society of Kingston. She is a co-chair of the Give 30 campaign, which is a non-for-profit charity focused on supporting local food banks across Canada. She is also the national board member with Islamic History Month, which is why she is again here with us, and holds a holds memberships at various interfaith and community level groups. And she also holds a PhD in biochemistry from Queen's University. I really don't know how biochemistry and history goes together, but I'm so happy to have somebody who has done some amazing work in this area. So thank you, Dr. Mona, for being with us again.
Jazakallah khairan for having me again. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Thank you. Next, I would like to welcome a young, emerging professional historian, Hassam Munir. Hassam calls himself a professor of Islamic history because his goal is to make Islamic history fun, I guess, or accessible to general public. Born in Pakistan, he has lived in Toronto, Canada for the past 20 years. He has a bachelor's of arts in history and communications, and is now pursuing a master's in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern history from the University of Toronto. Hassam is also a public relations manager at the Yaqeen Institute of Islamic Research. And in October 2017, he was recognized by Heritage Toronto as an emerging historian in the city. He has a broad range of experience in the fields of journalism and public history. So welcome for the first time, Hassam, to Canada Today.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you, Taha, for that introduction.
You're welcome. Thank you. So a lot of people think history is boring. And I wanted to ask you, Mr. Professor of History, first, are you a boring person? Because a lot of people think that historians are boring people.
I mean, that's just completely offensive. I am, in my own opinion, and I think I could get quite a few testimonials for this. In a gathering, I'm usually the clown, right? And I love to joke around. I love to have fun. And history itself is a very fun subject to not only study, but to share with others, to speak about, and even to think about. And I know how lame that sounds, but it's, part of the challenge is that the way it's taught, it's almost discouraging, right? To actually explore history in a fun sort of way, which is why I'm more into public history and trying to change that outside of the classroom and outside of academia to just try to find ways to make history fun. And there's ways to do it.
Awesome. And definitely, I know in person you are quite an interesting person for sure, and I can definitely see your insights into history makes you even more interesting, and so you definitely dispel all those myths about historians being, boring dead people. So thank you very much for sharing that. I wanted to start off with more serious questions, and that is, let's start off by talking about Islamic History Month itself. I mean, it was back in 2007, so 13 years ago, the government of Canada declared October being an Islamic, Islamic History Month across Canada, and there's a lot, of course, happened since then. But help us understand, help those people who have no idea, whether Canadian Muslims or general public. Mona, why don't you get us started by talking about what is Islamic History Month? And what is the point of it?
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'd. So speaking of history, I think I need to acknowledge that I am actually situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. And to acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, which predates the establishment of the earliest European colonies, and acknowledge its significance for the Indigenous peoples who have lived and continue to live upon it, including its Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee roots. But we also have a significant Métis community and peoples from other nations across Turtle Island. And of course, we're grateful to be able to live and learn, play and pray on these lands, and to grow and interact with those of diverse backgrounds. And especially as a Muslim, I would like to acknowledge that we have a responsibility given to us by Al Khaliq to protect the lands and respect all who live on them. So with that, and acknowledging of the history of these lands, I'd like to go into why Islamic History Month. And I think knowing our history, and this is one of the reasons why we'd like to acknowledge that we are on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, there is a perspective that, we as the Muslims, the Muslim community in Canada, may feel like an outsider. We feel like we're just new to this, we haven't really integrated in, but also from the community at large in terms of where do the Muslims fit in. And I think I always acknowledge our parents and that parental generation that were that established our community here in Kingston, but but the community did not start. We're not new in that we didn't start in the 60s and 70s when, say my parents came. And there is still that perspective that we're new, we don't belong. I have students that still, born and raised in Kingston, just like I was born and raised here, that refer to non-Muslims as, my Canadian friends, without acknowledging that they themselves are Canadian. And we need to acknowledge and learn that Muslims have been here and have contributed to the community in Canada for hundreds of years. I mean, we have that, we always quote the census quote that, the first Canadian born on these lands was James Love. The Love family immigrated from Scotland. They're the first documented Muslim family here. And that was in the 1890s. So it was, and then we had the people that were coming over, like the Syrians and the Lebanese, and Brother Hassam can speak about this, that came in the late 1800s. But I mean, we now know from, if anybody has read Sheikh Abdul Hakim Quick's book on Deeper Roots, Muslims have been in these lands for hundreds of years. I'm thinking like 400 years when they're coming with the slave trade. Muslims were here before Columbus, is what the catchphrase is, right? And by not acknowledging that history, and in a way, it's to take ownership and to say, you know what? No, I belong here. I'm not new to this country. My people have been here for hundreds of years. We've contributed to the society. We're as Canadian as anybody else. And we as Muslim Canadians need to acknowledge that as well and say, you know what? This is where Allah has decreed that we will be.
Mhm.
This is where we are meant to be, and you have a responsibility to the lands that you are in to contribute to the society in which you are in. We're not here by accident, and we have been here for a long time. And so there is nothing that would say that you are not part of this community. And that's why, in knowing where we come from, knowing where the Muslim community has come from, or how long they've been here, what they've done. I mean, as a Bangladeshi Muslim, I know, that Sears Tower, which is called something else right now, was designed by F.R. Khan, who is a Bangladeshi Muslim. Every Bangladeshi Muslim child should, I know I did, know that. And all the different contributions we have made in Canada, not just like around the world, but in Canada specifically.
That's so true. So, what's your perspective, Hassam, on this? I mean, you, as a historian now, of course, you talk about this all the time. You talk about the first Muslims, the pioneers. You talk about people who build the first institutions all the time. From your perspective, why is it so critical for us to have a history month like this?
So I think just building on what Sister Mona said, there is a general answer to this, which is related to history. Why is history itself important? And then there's a particular answer for Islamic History Month in Canada. And history itself, I think there's multiple perspectives on this and why it's an important subject to study, right? And from an Islamic perspective, even if we analyze the contents of the Quran, scholars estimate that approximately half of the contents of the Quran are stories of the past that were revealed during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and have been, of course, revealed for us to reflect on and to learn from them as well. So there's a particular a sort of reasoning behind that, and of course, Allah knows best, and Allah knows the wisdom behind the revelation in ways that we, of course, can't have full access to. But there is mention in the Quran as well. There's an allusion to this, that stories of the past are revealed so that we can take lessons from them. And it's sort of, to put it in different terms, the past is an external reference point. So we live in a particular moment in time, right? Like in the present, our lives. And when we see the world around us and we see particular systems in place and we see particular successes that are happening, and we see particular challenges that we continue to face, it's very easy to lose sight of the bigger picture of the human experience and just use your own experience as, quote unquote, this is the way things are. And so, what happens then is, it leads to a sort of stagnation when we don't stretch out the timeline. It's like, okay, human beings throughout history have explored many different ways to behave as individuals, many different ways to dress and eat, and to meet each other and to communicate with each other and to organize society, and to explore the world and wonder over the universe and all of these things, right? So maybe in our particular time, there is something that is not working, and we have to take a step back and start looking at other external reference points beyond our own present moment to see what are lessons we can learn from peoples in other times and other places, because the human experience doesn't actually change very much, or in a sense, human nature doesn't actually change very much from time to time. But the human experience is very diverse. So humans have faced similar challenges, similar problems throughout history, but they have found many different ways to try to address those. And they've had many different forms of successes and failures. And we should take the opportunity to learn from all of that. So that's in a general sense. The other thing I should point out is that when you study history, you get a very strong sense that, people are a product of their circumstances. And this is really important to understand, because the roots of a lot of hatred and a lot of division in society and a lot of sort of ignorant views of others are that they're sort of based in this idea that people are, you know, inherently bad, or one group of people is, you know, inherently X or essentially X, like they are this, right? But people are really a product of their circumstances, and so when we look at people throughout history, that's what we learn, that whatever they were trying to do, assuming that for the vast majority of people who have ever lived, all they wanted was to live a happy life, the best life possible. And they tried to do that in many, many, many different ways. And some of them were successful, some of them were not successful. And so when we start to develop that perspective that people are a product of their circumstances, that's when we stop essentializing people. And that's when we realize that if we want to see people do something differently, if we think like we ourselves and others can do something better, what we have to change first are the circumstances rather than pointing fingers at people, right? And this becomes a very baseline way to start changing our perspective away from hatred, from any form of ignorance and hatred, like racism, for example. So these are, you know, a few things to keep in mind. And I guess we can come back to the question of why Islamic History Month in particular.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you very much for that sort of overview there. And so coming back to Islamic History Month itself, Dr. Mona, can you shed some light on the history behind this proclamation back in 2007? I mean, we know it started off as a Bill 23 that was introduced as a legislative process that ended up being, of course, a bill that was passed and ended up being a proclamation, being that October is Islamic History Month. So who were some of the people behind it?
So I'm going to go from my memory because I wasn't really involved at that time, but it is my understanding, and I'm sure somebody in the comments can correct me if I'm wrong, that this was actually an initiative that started with the Canadian Islamic Congress back in 2007. And at that time, it was Professor Mohammed Al-Masri from Waterloo and Sister Wahida Valiente that were chair and vice chair of CIC at the time. And the push came from that organization. And you can look into that. So 2007, and at that time, there weren't that many communities that had kind of gotten on board. I think I know for a fact that Dr. Muhammad Bayoumi he has always been involved with Islamic History Month in Kingston. So we have been participating since the beginning in Kingston from 2007. And I think, it is kind of like you referred to the Give 30 thing, in that, it is a local communities work with their municipal governments to get the city to come. That's how we do it, to proclaim Islamic History Month. So you need to have that relationship. But then on the national level, and the provincial level, there are people that have been lobbying the different levels of government to do so. And it has become, there's a lot of supporters for it. So, alhamdulillah, it has been going on for this is the 14th Islamic History Month across Canada. And, we're proud to say that, in Kingston, this is the 14th Islamic History Month. I cannot speak too much of the history because I'm not familiar with it. But I know it did start with CIC. And then I think around 2014, CIC has now sort of disbanded around that time. And that's when Islamic History Month became more of an independent entity. And Sister Shahina Siddiqui has been chair of the national board, I think, since then. Dr. Bayoumi also has been very much involved. I know other members like Zeba Hashmi, who's now in London. She, I believe, has been involved from that time as well. I don't know all the details, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
Well, no, thank you for sharing that. And I think this I mean, whoever the incredible people were behind it, I know Dr. Al-Masri, Muhammad Al-Masri was one, of course, Sister Wahida Valiante, may God bless them both, and others who were behind it. I mean, definitely they were very visionary people. This was a post 9/11 era of a lot of hate and hysteria against Muslims, and here you have people who thought, you know what, if you want to take public perception, this is one tool, this is one way to celebrate history, celebrate culture, celebrate heritage of people who are being, of course, marginalized, and that's the only way to do it, to raise awareness. So I think this is a very of course bold move on their part to even think about it, and considering that 2007 is when it was passed, definitely the work that went on behind it must have been at least a year, if not longer, that it took for it to get where it is. So I mean, a couple of questions I wanted to ask you, one being, what kinds of activities? I mean, you are, Dr. Mona, part of Islamic History Month Canada as an organization now that runs or at least initiates and gives guidance on how Islamic History Month activities should be. So how does this work? I mean, do you give out a bunch of activities for the communities to adopt and take on, or do you suggest that various communities across Canada focus on a theme and sort of run with it and do their own thing in their local communities? And you did allude to it a bit, so wanted to hear how that works, and what thought process typically goes behind selecting a theme behind Islamic History Month every year.
So typically, I mean, we are a vast land and our communities are quite diverse. So typically what the national board, and I should make a disclaimer that I just joined the board this year. I've been involved on the local level before this, but Dr. Bayumi has been on the national board since the beginning. So my understanding is that from the national board perspective, what they do is we decide upon the theme for the year, and that happens, very, very early on in the year. And it basically, everybody sort of gives suggestions. A lot of it has to do with what's going on, what aspects of history might need to be emphasized, because you only hear about one aspect, but there's hidden gems within our history to deal with. And then that national theme gets distributed across the country, and we hope that different communities will join on with that, because then we can provide resources if needed. Like this year, I think starting last year, we have really been, everybody's been suggesting Brother Hassam as a resource for people across the country. And local communities basically do their own activities, because every community is different based on their own resources and what they have in their own communities. So for us in Kingston, we tend to always have a library display. We will have, like last year, it was on Islam and art. And so we had, the university, we have, we're lucky because we have such a close connection with the university, and Dr. Adnan Hussein is actually the director of Muslim Society's Global Perspectives here at Queen's. And so we can do a lot of collaborative work between the Islamic Society of Kingston and the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives to invite speakers to the campus. And we in Kingston, we always try to do things with the university community, because it's such an integral part of our community. So we'll have lectures on campus, sometimes through MSGP. We'll have lectures at the masjid. We'll have an open house. Last year we had one of the directors of the Aga Khan Museum so the Agnes Etherington Art Gallery was also a co-sponsor of that event because of the theme. And it's a lot of community reach. We actually had an art display from there's a local Syrian artist, and we had his work in one of the cafes downtown as well. So it really depends on the theme. But I think our staples have become the lectures on campus, lecture at the masjid, the library displays, as well as an open house. And then we try to do something for the youth. So last year with the art, we had a calligraphy course with the same artist. We've had speaking competitions, so it's called I Speak. essay contest. I think that there was actually a national essay contest a few years back, which trying to get it, trying to have a more national event. This year has been quite a challenge because of COVID. And so the majority of events have been going online. But it's a disadvantage in one way because we can't gather people, we can't have our open houses. But it has actually turned out to be quite a good, quite an advantage as well, because we can now put on national events. So this is probably the first time where we're having a national youth panel on Black Muslim youth experiences, and we are having youth from Vancouver, Winnipeg, Kingston, and Quebec. So we're going to draw on the experiences of Black Muslim youth of a variety of backgrounds, but also from across Canada, because, you know, each of the experiences will be different depending on where you live. The experience in Quebec is going to be different than that in Ontario, very different from that of Winnipeg. So I'm actually looking forward to that, to see how that would. So that is one advantage of having to go online, is that we can do these national events.
That's great. Thank you. Yes, COVID-19 has changed the world, and it means we have to change the way we're doing things. And there are some positive things that are coming out of it. So that's great.
And I think Brother Hassam is going to be like all across Canada doing events. I think I missed one with Imam Yaqeen, but I've seen his name from different communities. And alhamdulillah, we can now showcase those on the National Islamic Heritage Month page.
That's the best part.
So anybody from anywhere, Canada or beyond, can attend any of these lectures.
Yeah. Excellent. So a couple of things, Brother Hassam, I wanted to ask you, being a historian, couple of objections, let's put it this way, people bring up about history and Islamic history, right? So just like any history, there are going to be positives, there are going to be negatives. There's a beautiful side to Islamic history, and there is, sadly, of course, an ugly side, just like any history you study. The question a lot of people ask is, well, why glorify just the positive and the cool things that about Islamic history, but why not also highlight the ugly side? And not just Islamic history, it goes for, of course, any history again. So what do you say to that? Because I've heard this couple of people say this.
I think it's a completely valid point. So, history, like I mentioned earlier, is the range of human experience, right? And like I mentioned, there's been challenges to overcome, and people have done that successfully and morally, or they have done that unsuccessfully and immorally many times, and Muslims are no exception to that. And I think when it comes to our history, we have to acknowledge our own humanity. We are human beings, and we are going to make mistakes, and we are going to make serious mistakes. And there will be malicious people within our communities, and all of those things are completely valid. Now, what I would say is that, of course, there's a time and a place for particular topics and a particular approach, and people who are qualified to speak on them to have those conversations. And it's a responsibility that I think we need to take more seriously as a community to really explore, those cases of the sort of less than likable things that Muslims have done or been involved in. And after that, we have academics within our communities who should be having those conversations. And after that, we should design sort of programs or ways to sort of explain that to the public. And it's just because of oftentimes when there's particularly some kind of evil involved, there are sensitivities that need to be kept in mind of how people will perceive things, how the audience will understand what's being explained. And this goes for many positive things as well, by the way. It's a question of the sensitivities and the complexities. So, for example, during Islamic History Month, as fascinated as I am, I would not give a talk on, like Maliki Islamic law in North Africa or something like that, because it's a complex topic, and the people who approach it need to have a particular background. They need to have a particular understanding. There has to be some foreknowledge to properly process the new information that is being delivered to them. That's what I would say to that. I think as part of Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, we try to dispel many Islamophobic myths, and my work in particular is about history. Right? Did Islam spread by the sword? Did Islam spread through forced conversion? Right? Were all kinds of religious buildings destroyed by Muslim conquerors? And oftentimes, we have to say and be honest with ourselves and with our audience and say, yes, it did happen, and Muslims were involved in some of these very deplorable activities. Of course, not sanctioned or encouraged in any way by Islam. And again, that becomes a complicated conversation as well. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we ourselves internally, when we face that kind of question or when we face that kind of criticism, particularly from externally, we need to take it very seriously, and we need to take a sort of honest look at our history, have those conversations among ourselves, and then come through with an honest answer for the general public to sort of benefit from that as well.
What about this objection that people say, well, history is just subjective, and there's no way to prove history, unlike science, for instance, or math. It's like concrete numbers and chemicals you're playing with here. I mean, this is all abstract and it's all subjective, and it all depends on who is there, who is recording, who is watching, and then after that, who is interpreting today. What are your thoughts on that, Hassam?
I mean, there's no way around that, right? History as a discipline. I often joke with people that really I don't even really know if anything in history happened before I was about 5 years old, because that's my earliest memory. I don't know if the world existed before then, right? So, but of course, we have to work with the evidence that is available, right? There's archaeological evidence, there's literary evidence, there are evidences, and evaluating what evidence counts or what evidence is actual evidence. I mean, these are very complicated questions that historians themselves kind of struggle with. But one important thing to keep in mind that I'll say here, I don't want to go into this conversation because it is a very complicated conversation, and really, not to be dismissive of the question. I think it's an important question for anyone to bring up, but I do think that, again, it requires a certain level of, information beforehand and a certain level of understanding to have that conversation with someone. But I will say that one thing that is very important and something that needs to be kept in mind is that there's history and there's a thing called memory and collective memory, right? So how people choose to remember themselves, even if it's not 100%, supported by historical evidences, quote unquote, or, brought together in a very strong methodology in the field of history, it's extremely important to pay attention to what people choose to remember about themselves and about their background and that sort of thing, because ultimately that is going to shape their decisions and their worldviews, regardless of whether it's real history or not, right? So that's something to definitely keep in mind as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing that. Okay, well, let's talk about Islamic History Month again. And I wanted to, one of the concerns people share in our community sometimes is that, it's great. It's an incredibly amazing initiative that we have. We are talking about Islamic history, and we talk about Islamic heritage in Islamic History Month in Canada, and Islamic Heritage Month as it is known as in the province of Ontario. But are we just talking among ourselves only, just across the table and sort of preaching to the choir sometimes? Even though we can, sorry about that, even though we can argue that majority of Canadian Muslims don't even know their own history. So yes, that piece is very important. But are we reaching the masses? Are we actually having an impact? Like, for instance, Black History Month or other history months that are universally accepted across not only just campuses, but many other public spaces where there are, across education institutions as well as other public institutions, there are literally, planned resources dedicated to celebrating those months. So I wanted to ask your perspective, starting with Dr. Mona. What would it take for Canadian Muslims to get to a point where Islamic History Month will become a part and parcel of all institutions' celebrations and recognition of this critical month?
I think it is starting. So if you look at the Toronto District School Board, they it's called Islamic Heritage Month in Toronto. They have a resource book, from what I remember. I know they did it last year. Yes, right there. That is sent out to all the schools. And I know in our school board as well, when Islamic History Month comes, the events at least are distributed. The schools are notified, and you do get a lot of responses, people for people to come in and speak to them. We do also, I have seen that our equity person has also taken the TDSB resource manual and distributed to the schools here. Within the we are very lucky in that we have a university in the community, and there are many people associated with the university as well. So you do get that, even if one of the CUMSA members brings one friend, you do get that. We do get the publicity out there. And there are, depending on what the topic is, you might get even classes coming. We are very lucky to have Dr. Adnan Hussain as the director of the MSGP, who is actually just appointed the director of the School of Religion as well. So there are various avenues within Kingston and Queens, whether it's interfaith councils, the school board, and the university, to get that message out. And it's slowly becoming something that I think especially those spheres do anticipate and expect. And it is slowly, and we're fortunate that the municipal government has proclaimed it every single year. So like I said, we don't even have to book the illumination of City Hall anymore. It is a regular event that happens every year. And it's a constant, I think, for every community, it's a constant reaching out for media. They've been running things in the media. It's just basically making it known until it becomes anticipated. And I think it is slowly, it's been 14 years in some communities. So it is something that especially the schools and the universities are looking towards.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. There are now specific cities that are proclaiming gradually. You see that they are proclaiming, it to be a month that they were going to celebrate Islamic heritage. So that's a good part. You're right. And I think it's just a matter of time before we get to that point. I think this is very, very good conversation so far. And just as we conclude in the next few minutes, I wanted to ask both of you. Both of you have been doing some great lectures, programs, either organizing them or presenting at them. What were some interesting reactions you've come across? Is there anything that if you jog your memory and you think of positive or negative, that after a lecture, after or before a program, you got some feedback and you thought either it's really worth it, it made you think how much more work of awareness building and bridge building we still have to do in Canada, given sometimes the hate that comes with and pushback that comes with these kinds of outreach events. So Hassam, I want to hear from you if you have some interesting, memorable feedback or something that you came across.
Nothing in specific comes to mind, to be honest with you, but I think generally the response is overwhelmingly positive. One thing I will mention, since you just put this up, is I went to Washington, D.C. last year and gave a presentation there on the history of Muslims in Canada. And there were some very incredible reactions there because in the United States, they have such a rich and deep history of, Muslims of African descent. And Canada is almost like an afterthought. It's like, oh yeah, there might be like a few Muslims there too, but so when I went through it, people were quite surprised.
Wow.
and there was a good reaction there. And but the response is overwhelmingly positive, and that is the great thing of history, because it dislodges us from its, like I mentioned earlier, it dislodges us from our the current prejudices that we might have towards a particular group. And when you start to be more inclusive about the history and tell people that, the example I mentioned, North African Maliki law, that's essentially where the concept of the jury comes from, the 12-member jury, which is used in Canada today, right? When you start to bring these kind of concepts, half the world's languages, the word for eggplant is named after a 9th century woman in Baghdad who basically changed the recipe. Her name was Buran. So you have like aubergines, and in the West Indies, you actually have brown jolly, but it's brinjale, which is a version of her name, right? So when you start to bring together the very interesting kind of details, when you start to bring together the very local history as well, such as in places like Kingston, and I just want to mention this because we've been talking about Kingston a lot. To me, it's so special that so much of Islamic History Month happens in Kingston, and has been going on and has set sort of a precedent for other communities across Canada, because Kingston, and again, one of the things many people don't know, is a place that Muslims were interned in during World War I. So there was internment of Muslims in Kingston and Fort Henry before they were shipped off to remote internment camps in Northern Ontario, because they were from the Ottoman Empire. So to have a place like that lit up for Islamic History Month and people learning about Islamic history, I think that the more we learn our own history internally, and not just like the standard, it's often like, oh yeah, Islamic history, of course, Salahuddin and Jerusalem, right? Which is absolutely very important, but there's way more than that. And as long as we focus on these interesting aspects of history that actually get people's attention, bring them in for more conversation, and the local history that's just relevant for people based on where they live and the communities that they're attached to, I think Islamic History Month will definitely continue to grow. And that's the positive feedback that I've overwhelmingly received again and again and again, because people are learning and they appreciate a lot of that information that really catches them by surprise. And I think that's an important element.
That's amazing. You're right. Dr. Mona, we have a few minutes left. Any reactions you want to share that jump out at some point from your work?
I think in general, I agree. It's been pretty positive, and people tend to be, the non-Muslim community tends to be surprised. And what I wanted to say with respect to why not focus on the negative and the positive of history is that, especially post 9/11, I think that mass media and, with stereotypes, there is a very, a lot of those negative events are already there. People know that, but history is about balance and learning all of them. So all about it. So that's why we make more of an effort to talk about the positive, because it's not there for general consumption. And I actually appreciate the fact that we chose specifically Islam and art, or the contributions of Muslims to Western civilization, or even with we had a theme that had to do with the indigenous peoples. And the themes also sometimes happen to depend on what the situation is in Canada. So, the Truth and Reconciliation process, we thought it was very important to tie in something with the indigenous people in terms of healing and reconciliation. And with that, I remember that when we had our talks with Muslims and members of the indigenous community, which including, I think Hassam had referred to Professor Bob Lovelace, who is a Muslim indigenous person, we see the similarities between traditions, and it was very, very humbling, and it really makes you think in terms of what what messengers might have come here way thousands and thousands of years ago that influenced native and indigenous traditions. And especially for Islam and art, these are topics that nobody associates with Islam. But the Muslim community throughout history has made such contributions to science, to art, but nobody focuses on them, even within the Muslim community. We have to be real now. So to have something like this, it really piqued people's interest. And then when they realized the amount of influence that Muslims have had, even in the art world, it was very eye-opening, I think, for both the non-Muslim community and the Muslim community, I would say. So
Excellent.
it just opening up the doors of people in terms of, Islam is just not what you see on TV. It's not just about the 5 pillars. It's not just, all of these things, these stereotypes. It is a rich tradition that encompasses every sphere of life.
And that is the point, of course. Thank you so much for sharing that. As we come very close to our conclusion, I wanted to ask Hassam, you talk a lot about Canadian Islam and Canadian Muslims. This is a topic that's very close to my heart as well. And you've been talking about their history in particular, Canadian Muslim history, the pioneers. And this show in particular, we wanted to not talk so much about that because there's already a lot of great talks by you and others on this topic. The history of the first mosque and so many other amazing stories. But I wanted you to share with us why Canadian Muslims should learn history of Canadian Islam and Canadian Muslims and Canadian Muslim presence. I mean, if there were top 3 reasons you were to give, what would those be? Why is it so important for us to study Canadian Muslim history?
I think Sister Mona sort of alluded to, I don't know if I can, really put a top 3, but just to give you a general sense, I think we need to situate ourselves. We are as Canadian as anyone else, and that includes both the challenges that we face, the good and bad of being Canadian, and the desire to improve Canada and make it a better society for all. So that, I think, is one of the primary reasons that we need to situate ourselves and really think of this as our home. We didn't come here 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago when the Love family arrived from Scotland. And before that, Muhammad Bakwakwa and Nicholas Said and, these Muslims of African origin and people of Muslim background. Richard Pierrepoint, the history goes back way into the 1700s, into the late 1700s, and perhaps more than that as well. So that's the first reason. And tying into that is the second reason is that we need to explore more of this history, that there's so much to be uncovered, and there's a lot for us to learn. So with that in mind as well, we need to start with what we already know and familiarize ourselves with that. And then I think we will have the inspiration to sort of find our even deeper roots, as alluding to the title of Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick's book, as Sister Mona mentioned. And then finally, I find this a very important counter, and not so much of a counter, but undermining the whole concept of Islamophobia, which we know, time and again. Right up to, a few weeks ago, we find incidents that seem to be motivated by hate, in which Muslims are severely affected in Canada. And just sharing the contributions that Muslims have made to this land, sharing the ways that Muslims have built, this country and this nation alongside peoples of all other backgrounds, I think is important for us to develop our own strong sense of identity, and also to remind others that regardless of whether you think we are strangers or newcomers or whatever that is, it's certainly not the case. It's just not true. And this is our home. We are not going anywhere. And we are going to strive and be at the forefront, inshallah, of making Canada a better place for everyone who lives here.
Mm-hmm. Inshallah, excellent. And is of course not the inshallah that we've been hearing on making headlines lately. So it's a real inshallah. I wanted to end with 2 questions, one for each, 1 minute each, because we have very little time left here. Dr. Mona, what message would you give to our neighbors who are not of Muslim faith in Canada, in terms of, or the reasons why they should celebrate with Canadian Muslims Islamic Heritage Month, and why they should learn more about Islamic heritage in Canada? 1 minute.
1 minute. I think it's because, it is part of our Canadian history. That is the thing. This is part of our Canadian history. And I'm going to do something that I did in the debate, and I really want to talk about why we chose this topic, if you don't mind. in terms of Black history, history of Black Muslims. And the reason is that, within our current climate, when we see that rise of anti-Black racism, specifically anti-Black racism, what we know is that anti-Black racism is something that is pervasive within all spheres. And we as a Muslim community are not immune to that. We see anti-Black racism within our own masajid, and our Black Muslim brothers and sisters may not feel included. We need to also acknowledge that the trajectory of Black Muslim history is different than the majority of Muslims in Canada. The majority did not immigrate here. They came hundreds of years ago, as Brother Hassam said. They were brought over as slaves. There were some that came over as explorers, but that trajectory of history is very long, and it's very rich. And there have been so many contributions towards North American culture based on the memory of the descendants of those slaves or those explorers that we alluded to in our recent panel. And one thing that I think it was Imam Yassin pointed out, maybe Imam Abdul Rashid, in that Islam came to Africa before it spread in the Arabian Peninsula. The early Muslims were sent to Abyssinia. I took a course with an online course with Sheikh Mendez, where he pointed out that there are words in the Quran where Allah Arabicized Ethiopian words, like Firdos, Jannat al-Firdos. Firdos is an Arabicized Ethiopian word. So that connection, those connections that the Prophet ﷺ was making with the African people, these are long standing connections that were before even spreading towards the Arab world. And we need to move beyond tokenizing Black Muslims to, Bilal or Ayman. There are so many characters in our own Islamic history in terms of Black Muslims, the early Sahabas, and we don't know them. We don't acknowledge the Blackness of our prophets. And that is something, especially for our Black Muslim youth, that is very important to know their heritage, to know the contributions, because it is part of their identity. And we have to be real in that, the masajid, the MSAs, they are not necessarily inclusive to those who are not Arab or South Asian, basically the Arab and Deshi communities. And this is a way to show that, they're not, being a Black Muslim doesn't mean that you originated from the Nation of Islam, that you are a convert. And that is what, unfortunately, the go-to is, somebody's reaction is. And it's wrong. And the Black Muslims community has been here longer than most of us.
Yes.
And that needs to be acknowledged.
Excellent. Thank you very much for helping us end on this very, very important and critical note, and tying it back to, of course, the theme of this year's Islamic History Month in Canada. So thank you so much, Dr. Mona. And I want to just end with Hassam, a question more specifically. If people who are watching are pumped as I am about learning more about Islamic history, whether it's Black history, Black Muslim history, Islamic history, Canadian Muslim history, or any aspect of her history, what would be a couple of good resources you would point people to, Hassam, in the next 1 minute?
So, this is a very tough question to answer because there is just so much history, right? But I'm going to focus on the theme as well, that the Islamic History Month theme, and two books in particular that I would recommend. The first one is by Dr. Sylviane Diouf, and it's called Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas. There you go. Incredible book. And the second one I would recommend is by a Black Canadian female professor, a woman professor who is also Muslim at Dalhousie University, Dr. Afua Cooper. And I would recommend her book, The Hanging of Angelique, The Untold History of Slavery in Canada and the Burning of Old Montreal. That's what the book is called. Wow. So certainly I think we need to revisit that history. And then, there's bits and pieces here and there. You can definitely check out my blog. I've done like a lot of, written a lot of articles on some of these stories there. And then one thing I would recommend, of course, don't believe everything you see on the internet. Use your critical thinking and your sort of reading skills. But at the same time, you'd be surprised at what you can find if you search up, for example, Black history in the Yukon. If you just Google things like this, Black history in Kensington Market in Toronto, be a little specific. You will be surprised at the incredible things that you will find. And if we regularly take some time, it's like, I'm going to maybe spend some time every weekend, maybe like 15, 20 minutes, just searching something like this. It would be amazing how much we can learn in a few months or a year cumulatively. And we would be a lot more sensitized and a lot more informed in, about these topics. So that's what I would recommend.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And actually, before we conclude, Hassam, what website people can go to find your blog? What is the URL? And also, Dr. Mona, the Islamic History Month website, if you can share that. And we will be, of course, sharing that in the comments as well. So, Hassam.
So my blog site is called iHistory, like iPhone. So I just, ihistory.co, not .com. So keep that in mind and hope you find it benefit.
Excellent. Looking forward to seeing more of it. And how about Islamic History Month?
So Islamic History Month, I'm just pulling it up here. We are mainly using our Facebook page. So it's Islamic History Month Canada. And all of the events across the nation we're trying to get, every local community might have its own Facebook page, but we are trying to pull those into the national Facebook page as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Brother Hassam Munir and Dr. Mona Rahman for shedding light on some very interesting and critical topic of Islamic history, aspects of Islamic history and Muslim history in Canada and beyond. So thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your candid conversation today and looking forward to more of this in the near future.
Jazakallah khair.
Thank you.
Assalamu
alaikum salam. Thank you. And folks, unfortunately, we ran out of time. There's so much we could have talked about, but definitely history, Muslim history, Black history, Black Muslim history, Canadian Muslim history. There's so much, and Canadian history in general, there's so much more to history. It takes you to a world beyond you. It opens your horizons, as we've heard from our guests today, in ways that we could never imagine. So let us make sure that we take a moment the next few weeks we have in the month of October and beyond to learn, enrich our own understanding of people around us and people beyond us. So thank you very much for tuning in today on this very important and critical show on Canada Today. I would like to thank Dawanet and TorontoMuslim.com for their marketing partnership, and of course to you, wonderful audience, and to our wonderful producers, Aisha and Saleha today. Once again, this is Taha Ghayur on Canada Today, which is aired on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.